Hi guys, it's Miss Landry, and this is your first video for today. You're going to have 4 of them, and I'm going to make sure that they're all less than 8 minutes, hopefully. But it's a lot of information, so make sure that you have either your guided notes or something to take notes with. So let's dive in. Let's talk about what this video is going to be about. This is video number 1. Your learning objectives for this video or learning targets. I want you to know what the 2 main schools of thought were in early psychology, so kind of 1800s roughly. Who were the key players? So I'm going to be giving you some names and telling you what they did. And then I also want you to get a basic understanding of the timeline of how psychology became a science rather than a philosophy, which is how it started. Now, your homework for tonight is going to be a TED Talk, which is about 14 minutes long with a reflection, and then reading just Mod 6. So take notes on Module 6 and then submit them to Canvas. So let's get started on the information. So let's start with history, okay? When you think about science, some of the things that come to mind are things like chemistry and biology and hopefully physics, right? Like those are the main science fields that you think of when you think of science. Psychology is actually really new as a science compared to all the other fields in science. So we're still learning a ton about psychology, and I feel like the next few decades are actually going to be amazing in this field. So hopefully you find that you really like it. Oops, let me get my mouse here. Okay, let me clear it. Sorry, I'm still learning how to use this. So let's start with, how did it go from a philosophy to a science? When I say it was a philosophy, it was basically a lot of, well, old white guys thinking, okay? So people like Aristotle and Hippocrates, who is the one who started the Hippocratic Oath is based on. All of these older Greek and Roman philosophers were asking questions like, how does our mind work? Where is it? Like, is there a physical mind? How do our bodies relate to it? And then also, what happens after death? Okay, so is the mind still there, but the body is no longer usable? Or are they both gone? And so their whole, I guess, work towards psychology was all about just a thought. So it was philosophy. Now, when we move into the late 1800s, and we're going to talk about who was responsible for this, we basically became, this is called when psychology became a science, and it moved from philosophy to empiricism. Now, empiricism is something that we use data. So when you think of the term empirical data, like what's the data? That's what we're talking about. So we looked at experimentation and observation and started collecting data on mind experiments. So that is the difference. So kind of from like about, I don't know, 400 BC to 1879. So it's a very long time for it to have become a science. But there's some cool stuff that happened when that did happen. So let's take a look at it. I already kind of went over this. Empirical means data. Okay, so the first person I really want you to know about is Wilhelm Wundt. You always pronounce the W's as V's when they're German. He was the first psychologist to set up a lab and actually do experiments. So and this was in 1879, so that's when we said it was the birth of psychology. And his experiment is seen in this picture, and he basically was testing and observing, like, I'm going to press a button when there's a sound that's made, and the person has to think about what they're doing. And so he would play the sound, and then the person would press a button. So that's the first observation. The second time, he said, okay, I want you to press a button when you become aware of the sound. So you have to think about it rather than just letting your brain do it. And the people were a lot slower when they had to acknowledge that they heard the sound, which was kind of, it sounds so simple, but yet that's really important, right? So that was kind of the first experiment for psychology. This is just a kind of a brief history with a few people in here, and I just want to run through them really quick. I already talked about Aristotle. He was the one that kind of started that philosophy of what is the difference between a soul, a mind, and a body, and how do you make decisions? John Locke, I definitely want you to know this term right here, tabula rasa. So he believed and kind of started the thinking that people are born with blank slates. That's what tabula rasa means, blank slate. So, and it's only through our experiences. Sorry, there's some motorcycles outside, but it's only through our experience that we start to build a personality and kind of build that mind. Then here's Wilhelm Wundt that we already talked about. He's the father of psychology. So in 1879, this is when right here it becomes a science rather than a philosophy. Now, it's up to you how you want to decide that, but think about this. It is kind of the first time that we started collecting data rather than just thinking. Okay, then we have Sigmund Freud. So Sigmund Freud, he developed psychoanalysis, which is basically looking at how the unconscious drives us and forces us into decisions. The unconscious mind was the big thing with Sigmund Freud. When you think about psychology, you know, when you picture like the couch and the person laying on the couch while the person is taking notes as they talk about their childhood, that is psychoanalysis, which is Sigmund Freud. Early 1900s, we have Carl Jung, and we're going to go into more about Jung later on in the course, but he basically started talking about different archetypes and different personality types, which we'll do some personality tests. I always love doing those. So let's move on. Oops. Okay, so the first schools of thought. So this was kind of back with Wilhelm Wundt in the 1800s. He believed in kind of a thought idea of structuralism. So when you think about structuralism, I want you to think about the root word here, structure. Okay. Now I'm not talking about like the brain, but what I'm talking about is the parts. So when he's looking at a decision, Wilhelm Wundt was thinking to himself, like, what are the parts that built to that decision? Okay. So what are the mental processes? How do they operate? Introspection, if you remember, that was the part where they have to think about thinking. So introspection was like, oh, I heard the bell, now I should press the button, versus just hearing the bell, you press the button without really thinking about it. So then his student came up with this idea of functionalism. So let me change colors so we don't get confused. This is really different. And what is the key code here? Functional or function. Okay, so in this case, if you're a functionalist, you want to know, why do people do what they do? How does it work like that, right? And this kind of comes from evolution and biology. And think about this, okay? Let's do it this way. So I have two psychologists. One's a structuralist, one's a functionalist. And it's in the 1800s. They've never seen a car before. And they come across a sports car. Yeah, I can't draw those very well, okay? So what is a structuralist going to do when he first sees the sports car to try and figure out what it is? Well, he's going to take it apart, or she. If you're a structuralist, you're going to take the pieces apart to try and figure out what they do and then how they work together. Versus if you're a functionalist, you're actually going to get in the car and start pressing buttons to see what they do. So a functionalist is all about function. A structuralist is all about the parts. I hope that helps. We've already done some of this. We already talked about Wilhelm Wundt in the late 1800s. So that was when it became a science. Freud, we've already talked about. We're going to talk in more detail about Watson and Skinner. These are behaviorists. You've probably heard of Pavlov as well. He was also a behaviorist. So we're going to look at like what those approaches are. Then we kind of have this kind of blank area here. There were some wars going on. And then we have Rogers and Maslow with the humanistic approach. So looking at the whole person. And it was a very positive approach. You might think of Maslow with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we'll talk more about those. The cognitive approach kind of started in the late 1950s, which is all about how do we think? How do we develop memories? Then in the 1970s and on, as we started to get really good machines for looking at the brain and seeing the chemicals, and we now understand about neurons, we started looking at the biological approach. And that has now led into cognitive neuroscience. So looking at the neurons and the chemicals and how it all works together. It's pretty amazing. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and it's really cool. I really want you to think about this, okay? In the last 20 years, we have learned more about the brain and its function than in all the years before that. And there is still so much to learn. So I think the next few decades are going to be just amazing in this field. So that's it for this video. Make sure you have all your notes and jump into video 2. Thanks, guys.